The Mixed Blood Project is a cross-cultural poetry and talks and publication series. The series focuses on contemporary avant-garde, um, uh, on the contemporary avant-garde as it relates to the languages of race. Mixed Blood invites to campus writers who are able to address that relation and or aspects of it. Visitors to the series at Berkeley have included Wade Compton, Monica De La Torre, Harriet Mullen, Norbesa Phillip, John Taggart, Claudia Rankine, Banu Kapil, and several others. The series is unusual in its emphasis on literary innovation and its deliberate and very aggressive emphasis on race and culture and the languages of and about race and culture. It's also an unusual series because it pairs talks by poets with their readings. So come back tomorrow for Jen Hofer's poetry reading. This semester, Jen Hofer is the Holloway Lecturer in Poetry and Poetics at the University of California. I met Jen Hofer almost 30 years ago when she was an undergraduate at Brown. Meeting her and talking with her about poetry that week is one of the high points of my visit to Providence. I remember it vividly. It's a joy to have Jen here, even on Zoom. Jen Hofer is an internationally prominent poet and translator of poetry. Her 2011 translation from the Spanish of Miriam Moscona's Negro Marfil, Ivory Black, published by the Figs Press, won the 2012 Landon Translation Award from the Academy of American Poets and the 212 PEN Award for Poetry and Translation. Her edited volume, Sin Puertis Visabels, an anthology of contemporary poetry by Mexican women, won the Caden National Translation Award. She's the author of 5 poetry books, and the books appear as small press runs published by avant-garde houses. One of the books is called One. Douglas Kearney described that book this way. He wrote, "One is filled with many. Quotations become limbs from dismembered newspaper articles, atomic noir film dialogue, and song lyrics, which slowly bleed into Jen Hofer's own poetic interrogations, reports, and outcries. It is as though the viscera, once confined to our separate bodies, is everywhere, staining everything into a charnel unity which Hofer must search and identify." Another book, Slide Rule, contains numbers of lettered corporeal manifestos. Of Slide Rule, publishes weekly notes that Hofer takes readers on a lexically intensive tour of strategies to make the skeletal stick still. Other books are forthcoming, but Jen has also written of the desire and the intentional decision, as Jen says, to foreground translation, collaboration, literary, artistic, social practice, small scale DIY, DIT, that's do it yourself, do it together, independent publishing, and cross-language activism over and above solo productions of books and other projects that center individual creative output. Jen Hofer has staged performances in live film narration, neo benchy, public letter writing, etc., at the festivals for all Skid Row artists in Los Angeles, at the De Jong, at Where Were We International Art Festival in Denmark, at Pratt Institute, and elsewhere. Jen Hofer is a certified court interpreter in Spanish and is accredited by the Court Interpreters Program of the Judicial Council of California. We're honored by Jen Hofer's presence as the 2021 Holloway Poet. I'm honored by Jen's presence on the Mixed Blood stage. Please welcome Jen Hofer.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I would like to know if you can hear me. So if your video is on, just give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. So I want to say that I want to say many things. I'm about to say many things. I want to start by saying how happy it makes me to have shared so many different kinds of experiences with you, Cecil. I remember our first meeting meeting extremely well, and it forged a friendship. And I want to talk a little bit today about relationality and the role that that plays in how we make our work and why we make our work. And this is a perfect example of that. And slight preview of my reading tomorrow, I'm going to read a poem that features a visit that I made to Cecil when you lived in Pennsylvania. So I didn't write it at that time, I wrote it about your house. So yeah, so I just want to make it clear how grateful I am to be here and how really nourishing it's been to be able to teach here. I'm very inspired by my beloved students, and their words are helping me to shape the illuminated lecture that I'm about to give, which is called Cellular Spaciousness. But I actually want to begin. I also want to thank Jeffrey and Jessica and all of the people whose names I don't know who probably make it possible for us to all be here right now. And also just say that I'm a little overwhelmed to see the various parts of my life clashing in the participant list. So maybe I should close the participant list. One more introductory note, which is that I am a fan of the chat. So please use it if you wish to use it. I'm also a fan of the Zoom reactions. So feel free to use them if you know how to use them and you want to. And I am perfectly happy to be interrupted at any moment. So if you have a question, I encourage you to ask it. You can raise your bot hand if you know how to do that. You can write it in the chat or whatever, but I'll be attentive to all of the modes of communication as best I can. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm also going to describe what I have in mind for today. So you're going to also get this view of the side of my head a lot, I think, because I am sharing a screen from a different device so that I can actually look into this device and see you all. Okay. Hopefully this will work. Okay. So quick Zoom note. You can see if you want my screen, screen share to be smaller than it is, there's a little double bar in the center of your screen, or it should be in the center. You can slide it around if you want to see my face bigger than the other part of the screen, or vice versa. You can play with that. Here's how this talk is going to work. So the color of this slide is inspired by the cover of the first ever issue of Mixed Blood, which I am very privileged and honored to be part of. I'm going to start by reading really briefly from what I wrote for Mixed Blood almost 20 years ago. And while I do that, I'm going to give you a chance to contemplate these phrases. So I'm going to tell you right now what you're looking at. This is a process that I co-created with JD Pluker, my cherished collaborator, as part of Antena Aire, which was making work together for 10 years. We just stopped making work, and the very first thing we did when we stopped making work together was to write a piece collaboratively about stopping making work. So some endings are not endings. So we started doing aleatory improvised lectures, and I really liked that process, and so I decided to try it on my own. So what you see here are phrases that my students have written in response to the work that we're reading this semester as journal prompts or discussion prompts. So I took phrases from each week of discussion that we've had. Sometimes I took 2 phrases. My students' names are at the bottom of the slide, so you can give them some appreciation if you like the phrases. Many of them are here. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, if a phrase calls to you or you're interested in a particular phrase, you can either unmute and say it aloud, or you can write it in the chat. And I will use that phrase to guide the work that I'm going to share with you this evening. Are there questions about how this is going to work? Okay, if it seems less clear as we keep going forward, we'll just pause and we'll think about it again. So I'm going to give you a chance to, thank you, Julia. I see the first question. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from Mixed Blood, and then I'm going to think about in which ways I am the water. Okay, so the piece that I wrote for Mixed Blood is called Capillary Quakes. A text is, on the whole, but a fault line. Trans manifesto notes towards. It was a very strange pleasure to dive back into this work in preparation for this talk and see where I'm still aligned with it and where I've traveled since. So hopefully that will be legible in what I share this evening. Though an impulse towards an exterior towards the foreign. Translation does not primarily help us get out, except perhaps in the sense of getting out of habit, out of place. Translation rather helps us get in. It changes the setting, purposefully disrupting our previously established arrangements and articulation by introducing outside elements. No facile window, no pastoral view shining sunny light to illuminate what it's like over there. Translation works as the translator or the reader of literature in translation works through language or languages into complexity to complicate our perspectives, both here and there. For don't we exist and write and read inextricably in some difficult, always different in between? Translation works in shadow and light, luminously throwing both the distant and the immediate into relief. The view we are afforded includes ourselves. If translation is the rigorous, alchemical, mobile transformation of one language, mode of thought, set of limitations, realm of possibility, into another language, mode of thought, set of limitations, realm of possibility, that transformation is multi-directional, tentacular, refracting. English, to take translation into English as our example, is made other than itself by the inflection of other languages within its borders, already and constantly more porous, already and constantly further unraveling, already and constantly traversed. English is a potential, an expanding idea, a space where more space is constantly made. Tortilla, luau, origami, powwow, perestroika, karma, double entendre, and the tongue with which that potential carves an ever widening, ever fractaling, ever more international sphere of influence for English is forked, is more than forked. The co-optation implied by the wholesale, though not uncontested, witness California's Proposition 187, just one of many examples at the time, and sadly there have been many more since. Incorporation of elements of other languages into English implies to a fraying of any ostensible singularity as English is infiltrated by other languages, other cultures, and in its very nature welcomes the making multiple of a language that never was and can now never be singular. And beautifully, as it happens today in class, we were talking about manyness and non-singularity and how translation perhaps is, as an always collaborative practice, is always about manyness. So what I see in the chat is, the first question I see is, in which ways are you the water? In which ways are you a vessel? And those two go together. So I'm going to answer, in which ways are you the water? In which ways are you the vessel? And I'm going to respond to that question. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment by reading to you a little bit from a translation that will be out very soon. By the Uruguayan, it's a book by the Uruguayan writer Virginia Lucas. The book is called Ame Rica, Tu Valor de Cambio, which I've spent maybe half the time I've spent translating this entire fat book working on the title, because it has many multiple meanings embedded in it, and actually wrote a whole essay about that title. So if you're interested later, I'll drop the link in the chat. My translation, which I feel like is always going to be a working translation of that title, is Ah, Me, Rich, Ah, Your Exchange Value. The reason I want to read from this in response to the question, in which ways are you the water, in which ways are you the vessel, is because I had a very particular view of translation when I wrote the essay that I wrote for Mixed Blood. It was the year after Sin Puertas Visibles, the anthology of contemporary poetry by Mexican women that I edited and translated. It was the year after that had come out. So I had been steeped in translation and the cat herding involved in making an anthology. And I now, this is a very different project, working with only one writer, and I have a very much more interventionist approach to translation in relationship to this project specifically, part of which comes out of thinking about the ways that the translator and the writer are the water and the vessel for one another. And that relationship is not unidirectional. It's not like there's the original over here, and I'm going to do my stuff and I'm going to create the translation and it's over here and it goes only in that direction. There's a constant flowing back and forth. And I find myself as I channel into and out of someone else's vocabulary, translation as a way of inhabiting someone else's way of approaching language. What a relief for those of us who spend so much time inside our own ways of approaching language. I realize that I'm both taking my lead from Virginia or from whoever I'm translating, but I'm also guiding the work into this new shape. So that question of who's the vessel and who's the water is one that I'm not sure I could ever answer. So I thought I would read something briefly that illustrates that. Okay. I'm just setting a clock so that I don't turn into that person. Okay. I'm going to read, usually I would read in both Spanish and English, but I want to read a piece that's a little bit longer than I'm comfortable. I don't want to take the entire time of my talk to read this piece, but there's a particular reason I wanted to read this piece. So I'm just going to dive into the English only. And it begins with a footnote. A note on notes. Virginia Lucas's work contains footnotes, some for purposes of explanation and some for purposes of expansion, counterpoint, provocation, pique. In translating Virginia's poems, I translate her forms and uses of language, including, of course, her notes. And in translating what is not translatable in her work, that is, what is most important to translate, the snags or tangles or collisions that don't really readily succumb to expression in English, and hence become opportunities for us as readers to become translated, or for English to be de-Englished, I take recourse in the form of the note for purposes of explanation, expansion, counterpoint, provocation, pique. That is, I'm following the lead of Virginia's poetics, even as I lead them astray. Translator's note. Tacuarembó, introduction. The day we arrived in Tacuarembó, we didn't recognize the streets. The plazas were laid out along a straight line, and the city, traced along that axis, opened out on both sides of the avenue like a feather. At the Tacuarembó Club, a blonde senora approached us just a few minutes before the book launch. We talked. She was quite small. She was wearing a tight, short gray jacket with a pearl necklace resting on it, and there was a bit of a smell about her that invited an invented memory of my grandmother. Let's go meet the vicepresidenta of the Charrua Nation, she said to me, and she laughed. I followed her, thinking about the words democracy, nation, and state of Uruguay. Suddenly, into my mind came a memory of the Charruas cutting one of their phalanges. At the suggestion of the blonde senora, I looked for the India, or for my impression of her. I wandered through the hall. The white plastic chairs and a painting hung at the far end of the space's light blue wall. The painting depicted a young woman with long, straight hair, dressed in white. She was holding a dove in her hand. Behind her body, you could see a face in the shape of a sun. The young woman in profile in the painting didn't resemble the upright aspect that was talking to me. Pleased to meet you, I told her. Enchanted, a pale face said, with a Basque face and an unhospitable gaze. Taciturn, I'd say today, repeating from memory what I learned in school about the gaze of the Indios. Of course, she did have straight hair parted down the middle like an A-frame. We talked. I told her about a project I had done at school about Sal Si Puedes a few years earlier. Note, Sal Si Puedes refers to the 1831 mass capture and massacre of Charrua indigenous people at Sal Si Puedes Creek, often considered as a culminating moment in the genocidal extermination of the Charrua. It is estimated that there are between 160,000 and 300,000 people of Charrua ancestry alive today. Sal si puedes literally means get out if you can. There are places called sal si puedes in a number of Latin American countries, including Chile, Mexico, and Panama. When rereading the manuscript of this translation prior to publication, Virginia wrote me a note. The Charrua people were historically exterminated in the Salsipuedes massacre by an order of the future first president of Uruguay. The massacre occurred at what is currently the border between two departments, Tacuarembó and Paysandú. I don't remember if I ever told you this story, Jen. Apart from its anecdotal value, they say that Charrua men traveled to the place with their women and children. Though the extermination was massive, the national history books I read in childhood celebrated that we had freed ourselves from savages. Some women escaped, while others gave birth to their children and organized once again in Tacuarembó. End quote. Narratives of indigenous extermination are common in South America, and while genocide of indigenous peoples was, as Virginia's note expresses, inextricably woven into the foundations of geographic and social concepts of nation, in many places we now delimit as countries, a suspect or at the very least ideological construct in itself. The idea of total extermination is itself a construct designed to invisibilize the ongoing living presence of people of indigenous ancestry across the Americas. Sal si puedes, then, could refer not just to the urgency imposed upon indigenous peoples to flee the lands they steward to preserve their lives and community, but also to the unfleeable reality so many Mesticex and European descendant peoples deny, that indigenous cultures continue to thrive, to organize, to follow the threads of the inconclusive filament of a tradition disregarded. I knew that the Charrua nation existed because I had seen stickers on a number of thermoses with that name and printed on them a drawing of some boleadoras. Note, a weapon used primarily for hunting by the Charrua and other indigenous peoples made of hard stones polished into spheres, tied together with leather cords. Translator's note. Quickly, and before giving her a chance to respond to me, I added, another of my friends is Charrua, and I pointed her out. She had a son who was born with a blue splotch on his back. When the boy was born, the doctor told her the splotch was mongoloid. And Charrua, I added. The blonde senora, the one with the short gray jacket, quickly went to look for the petite Charrua woman she had pointed out to present her to the vicepresidenta of the nation. Meanwhile, her representative was asking me about myself, about my family origins. As you can see, my olive green color is Moorish. It comes from my grandmother Nefer, though at some point, I don't know anything else and the family tree gets cut off, I told her. There, she said, with both gaze and voice taciturn, there where the tree is cut and there is a question mark, that question mark could point to your India ancestry or Charrua ancestry, she added. The names that aren't anchored, the ones that aren't recorded, bodies gone stray in a distant city, Tacuarembó, like the inconclusive filament of a tradition disregarded, the traces of which flush Nefer's cheeks, curb the inconclusive wandering of a few inconclusive shadows through the hills. Note, to make visible, if not conclusive, what might otherwise be invisible within the inconclusive, how we got to some of the choices we got to in the translation, and at times in the original, how it happened poco a poco, decision by decision, that the roles of writer and translator began to blur and intermingle, how Virginia invited my participation, welcomed my intervention, opened the door to my consciousness as one of the many consciousnesses presented in her work. This sentence that I just read originally contained the word inconcluso twice. Los cuerpos extraviados en una ciudad lejana, Tacuarembó, como el filamento inconcluso de aquella tradición ignorada cuyo rastro enciende en Nefer las mejillas y refrena el deambular inconcluso en el monte de unas sombras. Here's a translation into English of the conversations that led to the decision to include that word 3 times in one sentence. JH, you're using inconcluso twice in one sentence on purpose, right? VL, I'm not clear on that. It can change. There's no intention there. JH, well, I'd only change it if you're going to change it in the original. So tell me, what do you want to do? And I'll follow your lead in the translation. VL, let's change it. Yeah. JH, perfect. We'll change one of the inconclusos. To what? You tell me how the sentence will read, and I'll edit both the original and the translation. VL, however you tell me to do it, Jen of my soul. JH, I have two different suggestions. So then I wrote couple of different suggestions. One was to make the error of using the same word twice in a row into a purposeful choice by adding the same word a third time. And the other was to change the word inconcluso to interminable endlessly the second time it appears. Virginia would likely have responded to these suggestions had I sent her the manuscript at this point. However, the day after I made those suggestions, my first foster child came into my life, and the eternally inconclusive poetic practice of parenting into the unknown took precedence, conclusively, if not eternally, over more literary poetic concerns in my practice. Some 2 years later, we returned to our conversation in the margins of this text. JH, as you'll see, my conclusively dear Virginia, I chose option number 1, to add inconcluso again to underscore the error instead of correcting it. How does that seem? VL, perfect. Or also you could change the word and then it'll resolve it. Perhaps it was an irresponsible writing act to leave it unpolished. Ha! By that point, however, I had grown accustomed and perhaps also attached to the triple repetition of inconclusive in the sentence, perhaps inappropriately so, as my overactive adjacency and enthusiastic intertextual interaction with Virginia's text, so distinct from a quieter and more transactional translation, veered more and more toward appropriation, the notes literally threatening to take over the page at times. I felt the repetition was a more Virginia Lucasian approach to the possible error that may not have been an error to begin with. Further, I felt it was more true to Virginia's text, that to polish it in the translating, thinking, conversing, editing, conversing, thinking, translating process, rather than smoothing the burrs, roughness, and snags, would do just the opposite. Our edits and these notes, penciling shadows at an angle to the text itself, providing a dimensionality that erupts them into disrupted relief, as these texts neither smooth nor soothe. They are in relief without providing relief. Translator's note. I'll pause there. That's actually not even the end of that poem, but I'll let it be the end for now. Okay. How do you own your own fire? So I'm skipping, Sam, I'm happy you're here, and I'm skipping that one for a moment to read from How Do You Own Your Own Fire? Thank you, Roberto, for that question. Okay, let me see, what was my intention there? Anyway, who am I and what is my purpose in life is my eternal question. Okay, got it. All right. Okay. One of the differences that I notice in myself, looking at the essay that I wrote for Mixed Blood and the way that I approach my writing now, is about how my own positionality and the ways that I talk about that, and the my willingness and actually my sense of responsibility to name all of the ways I can perceive my positionality and where I stand. I'm sure there's lots that I can't perceive, and I'm working toward that perception, and that's going to be the rest of my life. So this is an essay. I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs from an essay that I wrote in response. It's for an anthology that's coming out later this year on women and money. So I was asked to write about women and money. I ended up writing about resource sharing. So it's from an essay called Stay. And it starts with a quote from the poet Layli Long Soldier. Conversation about mother tongues versus foster languages, how to forge belonging. I've only ever lived in one spot in Los Angeles. I moved to the Northeast LA neighborhood of Cypress Park from Mexico City's Centro Histórico in 2002. For sale by owner, as is, the sign on the shipwreck foundering in its own history that was to become my house, was barely readable beneath exuberantly overgrown trees and weeds. The house, which we bought from the only living son of the couple who built it in 1920, was beyond a fixer-upper. It was a tear it down to the studs skeleton where it rained in the living room. Termites were both visible and audible along the entire dry rot compromised north side of the house. Dozens of stray cats, fed by the elderly Cuban sisters across the street, nested under the house and in the attic crawl space, easily accessible through gaping holes in the roof. The pipes were so rusted that a mere touch would dissipate them into billowing, blood colored clouds. Realizing it would be quite some time before we could do anything there other than demolition, imagination, and the occasional dance party atop the exposed subfloor, my then girlfriend and I bought a 1974 Airstream Argosy, the same make, model, and color my and a couple of audience members' maternal grandparents hitched to their avocado green sedan to travel the country when they retired, and lived in 16-foot by 6-foot, not so blissfully close quarters in a fake wood wonderland parked among the eucalyptus in our backyard for a little over a year while we unbuilt and then rebuilt the house. Our imaginations billowed, yet we could never have envisioned, even in our wildest unleashings, what and who we might encounter and how, as we made this unlivable house and our trailer perched on the dollop of land behind it, soil the consistency of stone and seated with rusted nails and broken glass, into a home. I don't believe in possession of much of anything other than our words, our actions, our mistakes, and other interpersonal, interpolitical accountabilities. Without the spark provided by a girlfriend whose family life was marked by a level of post-carceral instability that led her to want to grow enduring roots, it wouldn't have been my impulse to purchase a small sliver of Tongva territory not far from the confluence of the Arroyo Seco and the Los Angeles River, where the so-called pobladores first staked their erroneous claim on this land. The irony of the fact that in the end it is I who have lived in this home for nearly 2 decades is not lost on me. I take as a given that we exist in a context of white supremacist settler colonialism and voracious capitalism. It is in the heavy atmosphere of these oppressive forces that I feel responsible to enact a model of caretaking, stewardship, and gardening in the literal and metaphorical sense, tending to the seeds, blooms, and fruits that provide me and others sustenance. I strive and sometimes struggle to enact a spirit of porosity where my openness is grounded in both intention and intuition. I work toward a horizontalist practice of deep listening and deep expression, walking as lightly as possible on ground that does not belong to me, but to which I feel intensely accountable, offering as much as I'm able, welcome and sanctuary in the literal and metaphorical sense. I want to live within my means and with meaning and without excess, except where gratitude and other joyous emotions can exceed despair and distress, to identify the level of comfort I and others need in order to thrive, and the level of discomfort I can embrace in the effort to navigate and wherever possible right the imbalances that are the foundation for the structures of scarcity that delimit so many people's living. Good gardening practices produce enough abundance to share widely. As I grew comfortably uncomfortable with the reality of owning my house alone, it became clear that my charge was and is to find ways to make a meaningful home for myself and for more than just myself. I take inventory as honestly as I can. What do I have? What do I need? What can I offer? I locate myself within an intersecting web of privilege and invisibility. I read as white and come from a background of forced and chosen diaspora, rooted in economic distress and also economic mobility, racist genocide, and also race privilege. I am a queer person in an open relationship with a cisgendered man who is also queer, and it would be easy to mistake our relationship for heteronormative. I don't feel misgendered when people defer to she as my pronoun, though tend to feel somewhere to the left of binary and prefer the potentialities of the pronoun they. I speak English fluently and without an accent. Okay, with a California accent, some might argue. And I am the child of accented, non-native English. As a half Latinx, white privileged Ashkenazi Jewish person whose paternal family consists of just a few survivors of the Holocaust, and for whom being Jewish represents a cellular understanding of ethnic persecution that requires support of BDS and Palestinian self-determination, my relationship to whiteness and white supremacy is especially fraught. In trying to understand and inhabit the particular kind of diasporic whiteness I've been thinking through lately as off-white, I have acted out of self-hatred and hatred of whiteness, out of debilitating guilt and regret that stem from visceral and violent rejection of race privilege and class privilege, though manifesting those as guilt is damaging and useless, out of corrosive self-doubt and the paralysis that comes from feeling that my responsibility is much greater than my capacity, and my silence can perhaps do more good than my speech. These not so strategic coping strategies can also be viewed as a kind of protection from vulnerability, from exposure, from my own and others' humanness, from having to show up and be myself and speak honestly and listen genuinely, ready to be challenged, ready to be changed. And that section ends with a quote from the poet Biki Bertis. This is collaboration in zero gravity democracy, blurry violet lights and no clear answer. This is a nuclear glow in the dark so we can start over. We board planes to Mars and 6 engines fire. You spin away. So I'm going to bring back my slide. I'm going to take one more prompt, and then I'm going to open for questions. I think that might be good timing wise. I'm looking at Cecil's face and trying to read the signs. So let me bring back my slide. If that's not going to work because Zoom is going to do a thing to me. Okay, 1 second. I feel like I spend my entire life trying to prevent Zoom from doing a thing to me. Okay. Okay. There we go. So feel free to unmute and holler something out or chat me and let me know where you want me to go from here. Or maybe you don't want me to go anywhere from here, which is also a perfectly good place to be. Or maybe this is my sign that I should figure out what I wanted to say about the cistern walls. But I'm going to give it a minute too. All right. So I super appreciate, Julia, that you wrote into the chat again, but since I took your suggestion before, I'm going to go back to Sam's and I'm going to do some thinking about the sound that was coming back to us from the cistern walls. Okay, I might do 2 different things here. So that is actually from a week when that's from where we began in the migratory ear class. My class is called the migratory ear. We began, hi Brenda from Bob's computer. I must talk about ethical action another time, or ask me that in the Q&A. We began by reading reading and listening to Pauline Oliveros and thinking about deep listening and doing some exercises to awaken deep listening. And that plus my students' utter and complete brilliance sent us down an incredible path of responsiveness and relationality, both amongst ourselves as a group and in terms of our relationship to the world. And now there's so many people writing things in the chat. This is funny. So we'll see what happens in the Q&A. So I want to think about, or actually read from 2 different projects really briefly in response to the idea ideas around the sound that was coming back to us from the cistern wall. So that comes from a beautiful, beautiful project called Deep Listening that Pauline Oliveros and a couple of collaborators created, where they went into a cistern in Troy, New York, I think somewhere in upstate New York, and played music inside the cistern and realized that they were collaborating with the cistern as the music played back to them from the walls of the cistern. And so that idea that we are always collaborating with prior uses of language and future uses of language and other people's writing and art making and the world going on around us and history being made and unmade and all of the violences and all of the beauties and all of the joys that exist simultaneously in all times and in this time. That collaboration is what this idea of the cistern sort of awakened in me. And so I want to read just a couple of poems from this little booklet called Front Page News, which was published by Little Red Leaves Textile Editions. For 1 year, 10,000 years ago, the year I turned 40, I wrote a poem out of the newspaper every day for a year. This is what some of them look like. I'm not going to screen share them. If you want to see them later, just contact me and I'll show them to you. But so I basically made a cut up poem, a 40-word cut up poem out of the front page of the newspaper in the place where I woke up on that day, every day for a year. Actually for a year and 1 day, because I have problems with endings. So I'm just going to read you a couple of them from this. This little booklet is like 10 days worth of the front page news. Los Angeles, Sunday, April 24th, 2011. Home. In the contaminated zone, one warm spring, houses, air, food, water, tears, prisoners, hostages, power as force, locked access, overseas, and other nations have nothing. In radioactive breath, we eat, we drink, trying, remembered, buried, don't think. The years were a casket. Los Angeles, Friday, April 29th, 2011, battlefield. Killing, injuring, flattening, forcing. Nuclear power, the hardest hit. Bodies, grapple, struggle, shelter, the deadliest. Battered, swooping, deadly scythe, the death count, the day, the worst history. Consume, outrage, prices to increase, to reduce, a page torn book, law of supply and supply. Los Angeles, Saturday, April 30th, 2011. Security, cloud of debris and sky, or a deadly person, heart, concrete, fortified. Iconic hangar-like structure, graph paper, a looming nation outside their fleeting actions scribbled, poised against forces advancing on the advisor. Urging war or airstrikes or pressure, a brawny son would understand. So I want to just show you these 2 pages. I'm hoping you can see them. So if you can, I don't know how well you can see that, but they're, the constraints that I gave myself was 40 words, front page of the newspaper, newspaper from the town where I woke up on that day. And they had to, I didn't do this 100%, but I was trying to have them all be completely connected. So that's how you get a line that goes horizontally across the page, reading from column to column to column. I'm talking about my process partly because one of the joys of the class I'm teaching at Berkeley this semester is that we all come up with like a dozen generative prompts for one another every week. And so one of the things that I do, both to listen differently to the world around me, and also to try to get outside my own vocabularic habits, which seem always to be right there at the tip of my tongue, pen, or computer keyboard, is to try to be in collaboration with existing language. And so working from the newspaper or some other document is one way to do that. And then I'm gonna really briefly read, JD, you wanna read with me? So JD Fluker and I'm Benna Eide, formerly. This is another version of the sound coming back to us from the system walls. Actually, though, maybe instead of doing that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask if this is a good moment to move to Q&A. If it is, we'll do that. If not, I'm going to choose the prompt that either Tanya or Bethy just offered to me in the chat. So I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions at this moment. So ways that you can ask questions are you can write them in the chat, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can just unmute and speak.
Okay, I have a question. It's Alexi. Um, how long did it, like, did you think about writing that piece about your house? Was it something, I mean, how did you come about to write it? You know, since I'm doing the memoir thing, I wanted to see, because it's really good. I really enjoyed it.
So first, I just want to say thank you to my amazing Otis MFA writing class. I normally teach at this time, and my whole class came, and also my co-professor came to this talk. So thank you very much for being here. Um, so, I mean, I sort of feel like the answer to how long takes me to write things is it took me my whole life to get to the place where I was able to write a particular thing. So, it took me 50 years. Um, but also, that piece actually is not, I mean, that piece is not about my house. That piece is about being a foster parent. That piece is about resource sharing, in the form of providing sanctuary to folks who might need it in my home, literally, um, and making family in a way that potentially entails drastic loss. And what it means to stay. That's called stay because it's like the piece sort of centers on the idea of what it means, not to abdicate and just to stay when you aren't in control. So I wrote about my house as a way to get to the harder thing I was writing about, which was foster parenting. Um, so I'm not exactly sure if that answer or how to answer that question or if that answers that question, but I think where we have to go to get to where we need to be, like to get to the scariest part and the most uncomfortable part of the writing, I had to be able to enjoy describing some things about my house. And I love my house a lot. And I think it's a great story and it's a tremendous burden and it's a total delight and all the things. It no longer rains inside the house, by the way, but that's partly because it doesn't rain very much in LA. So yeah, I think that the paths we take to get to where we think we can't get to, but we actually can get to, those also deserve to be in the work sometimes, right? Like not we don't need to put out everything we write in the world, right? And we don't need to put out every first draft of everything we write. Um, so I'm not sure if that answers how long it took me. And I also feel like I'm not done. I mean, if you those of you who come to my reading tomorrow, you'll hear actually a different version of mention of those eucalyptus that got like filtered into a poem in a completely different way. And now you who are here tonight have a window into that mention in that poem that people who weren't here tonight or haven't read that piece or don't know me personally or haven't been to my home won't have, because poetry makes its sense in different ways. And we might choose to explain or not explain certain aspects of our poems embedded in the poem. So I think I've probably done a really good job of not answering your question, Alexi, but we can talk about it later in class. Okay, great. Um, what
Like,
inspired the newspaper project, Julia asks. Were you going to say something else? Or was someone going to say something else? I feel like I heard someone unmute, but I couldn't see who it was. Okay, the newspaper project was inspired by, this is Pancake coming to say hello. I feel like I should turn my camera like this so that you'll see like the cuter of the two of us. Um, uh, Pancake is also in that poem with the eucalyptus. So now you're getting even more like uh, learning about background information you would never normally hear about my poem. So I talked about this a little bit. I think the newspaper project was partly inspired by wanting to interact with language in a different way. And I've always had a concern since my very, very first earliest writings with the ways that information is fed to us and the ideologies behind how information transits and how language is used to such deeply political purposes, and wanting to interrupt that or intervene in that. So part of what inspired that was like wanting to break open the way the newspaper makes its sense and maybe expose the sense underneath that, or like make it make sense in a different way. And also, honestly, writer's block inspired it. I have a really hard time writing, to be honest. I have a really, really hard time. And if I can write in process, like literally process, I mean, like every single day I was like, I'm going to write a 40-word poem out of this newspaper. That helps me keep on track. It helps me feel like it's enjoyable. I enjoy cutting things up and pasting them onto pieces of paper. I'm an old school DIY zine maker and DIY bookmaker. So it sort of keeps me honest. It keeps me in my practice. It keeps me engaged in language and thinking in poetry at a time when maybe sitting down with a blank page in front of me or a blank screen in front of me is just going to lead to more blankness. So that was part of what inspired it. And also just wanting to mark being 40, which felt both monumental and completely and totally mundane, and like things are the same and nothing is ever the same. So those were the things that inspired it. Other questions?
Maybe a tiny question. This is Guy. You mentioned earlier the idea of turning errors into non-errors, and I'm in part. It was in part of your the translation of the Uruguayan writer that you're engaged in, and I'm just wondering if that is something that has is that a part of your practice per se, or is it something that you remain open to as you do what you do, whether it be translating or writing of your own poetry?
So I saw when I'm a co-host, so I saw when you came into the space, Guy, and I think you missed the first song that was playing when folks came in, which is "Make Another Mistake" by Sun Ra and his orchestra, and the entirety of the lyrics is you made a mistake, you did something wrong, make another mistake, do something right, and that just repeats over and over and over again, which is pretty much my anthem in life. And like others who are here in the audience, who I'm really happy are here, I am an interpreter. That means I live interpret I transfer language, spoken language from one language to another live bidirectionally. And that is a process. The entirety, big secret, the entirety of interpreting is making errors and recuperating from them. So you need two things, you need more than two things, but you need two basic things to be a good interpreter. You need badass deep linguistic proficiency and willingness to keep learning. And you need willingness to fail over and over again, recuperate, forgive yourself, move on over and over and over again. So failure is my teacher, error is my teacher, and my opportunity. And that is also the case with translation. And often in translation and interpreting, there's no one right way. In poetry too, there's no one right way to make expression. And to be willing, there's also this beautiful Adrian Keene, a wonderful Cherokee scholar who has a really amazing blog called Native Appropriations and a podcast called All My Relations with Matika Wilbur, visual artist. Adrian Keene talks a lot about being willing to learn in public, which of course also entails failing in public. And I take a lot of inspiration from that. So I feel like there isn't actually any other way to be honest in the world. If we only ever show our most polished selves, we're probably not doing the greatest learning that we can do. Or maybe I just tell myself that because I make a lot of errors. That's also possible. But you embrace what you can.
Yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful thing. And it immediately called to mind the Eno Schmidt oblique strategy of honoring your error as a hidden intention, or I can't remember exactly how they phrased it, but yeah, all of that's very, very wonderful. Thank you, Jen.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I'm wondering if there are other questions. I'm wondering about time. It's 8:03. I want to liberate you if you wish to be liberated, but I'm also happy to continue chatting, or I can end by reading a brief thing in response to the prompt that Betty Marin put into the chat. So either way, happy to do any of the above.
The last part.
The last part is one request out of 39 people. I guess 37 since there's 2 of me in here. Is that what folks want? I'm pausing. As an educator, I've learned not to be too afraid of silence. I'm pausing to see if anyone has a question first, and then I will move forward into reading a bit to end. And actually, I'm gonna choose this because I really wanted to read this and I wasn't sure if anybody would choose. So the prompt that Beppy chose is the language / image / color / nonsense / sound / silence / hurt / strength that muddles what you write. And this is a piece that, the reason I wanted to read this, you'll see why in a moment. So I actually, let me see if I want to do a quick screen share for 1 second. Forgive me for turning my head to you. I want to show you, so this is actually a different piece. I just want to really briefly show you what this piece looks like. I'm writing in a mode right now that I think of as poem essays. So this is not the piece I'm going to read from, but it looks very similar in certain ways. So you can see it has extensive use of quoted material. Roberto Harrison, who is here, actually appears in this piece. It has what looks like prose, what is prose, and it has like exploded poems, which is a form that I've written in for a long time. And then it goes back and forth between those things, or among those things, those elements. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this work is, so you can see there's, like paragraphs, there's quoted material, and then there's poemy material. The first essay I wrote in that mode was published in a book called The Body in Language, an anthology edited by Edwin Torres. It's called Embody Embered or Embody Embed, and it is written in that form. And it's the first work that I wrote in that form, partly because I felt like I couldn't say what I wanted to say with just prose or with just quoted material or with just poems. So I just decided to collide them all together, and it felt really, really generative. And I talked earlier about writing about the thing that that allows me to get to the thing that's harder to write about. And I feel like reading through I take incredible sustenance from reading other people's work. Many of the people here, I take incredible sustenance from reading your work, and I would not be the writer and translator I am, or the human I am, without work that's been produced by pretty much every single person who I know on the Zoom, which is most of you. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me and for giving me the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. And I'm just going to read briefly from this piece, which begins with a quote from my beloved friend, Tanya Foster. Tanya Foster writes, "Because you haven't spoken in so long, the tongue stumbles and stutters, sticks to the roof and floor as if the mouth were just a house in which it could stagger like a body unto itself." To be inside something, outside something, in the ocean, the horizon at eye level, out of it, you see it from afar. To be in it and to see it from up close, the body is weight, the body is visibility, the body is in the world, is the world, with the world at our back, or disappears into. Ruth Ellen Coker writes, "Indeed, we have come after a great disaster." Language is an oceanic body, a sharp and jagged body, a dripping body, simmering body, shimmering, uneasy, not metaphorical. Language is a bruised body, a body that knows how to heal itself, a body that will never be whole, still, tranquil, quiet, a body that speaks, a body spoken. Daniel Alexander Jones writes, "Who are we perceived to be by others, individually and societally? Who do we perceive ourselves to be, individually and societally? Who crosses boundaries? Who is caged by boundaries? Who wants the skin they are in? Who wants out? Who needs to feel fixed in order to know themselves? Who needs others to be fixed in order to feel fixed themselves? Who is hungry for belonging? Who can never belong? Who questions the nature of belonging? Who questions the nature of identity? Who can afford to? Who can't afford to? What are the underlying assumptions about race, culture, gender, etc., that have been and continue to be made? Dead bodies, wounded bodies, transformed bodies, hidden bodies, masqueraded bodies, performed bodies. Taking cues to keep asking questions at this time. The answers aren't working." Annabelle Guéderet writes, Ici je propose un corps sensitif sans organes en jouant sur la vitesse et les lenteurs, les forces et les affects. Here I propose a sensitive body, without organs, playing on speed and slowness, forces and affects. Body is receptor, is language, is transmitter, is body, is amplifier, is language, is eraser, is body, is effluent, is slip, is body, is burial ground, is language, is reactor, is body, is detonator, is language, is incubator, is body, is resolute, is language, is plumage, is body, is scaffolding. Body versus color versus culture versus gait versus stance versus skeleton versus skin versus marrow versus heart versus muscle versus circulation versus expulsion versus expression versus extemporization versus settlement versus temporality versus preparation versus instigation versus intimation versus intuition versus ear versus channel versus carnage versus language. Thank you very much. You can unmute if you want, and you could even let me hear you saying hello.
And that was
Hello.
exquisite. Thank you. It's still ringing in my head.
Wow.
Thank you, Tanya.
You're welcome.